Hello, this is Brian Otten of Apologetics 315. Today I interview Craig Parton. Craig is an attorney and author of The Defense Never Rests, A Lawyer's Quest for the Gospel, as well as Religion on Trial. He is also the United States Director of the International Academy of Apologetics, Evangelism and Human Rights in Strasbourg, France. The purpose of this interview is to learn more about Craig's work in apologetics, examine a legal approach to defending Christianity, and get his advice for those studying in the area of apologetics. Well, thanks for joining me today for this interview, Craig.
Oh, my pleasure, Brian.
Well, Craig, would you mind sharing a bit about yourself and the work that you do today?
Sure. I was raised in a non-Christian cult, Christian Science actually, for 18 years before I went to college. And then in university, my freshman year, was confronted with the claims of Jesus Christ by some Campus Crusade and InterVarsity staff, and became a Christian. Ultimately went on staff with Campus Crusade for Christ for a number of years, and several of those years was the national lecturer for Campus Crusade on university campuses. Then I wanted to spend some more time getting depth in the area of the defense of the faith and apologetics, so I did an MA with John Montgomery and some other people at the Simon Greenleaf Law School for a couple of years, which reignited my interest in the practice of the law. So went back to law school, and after that went to the firm that I'm at today. I've been practicing 25 years at the same firm as of last month. It's a 25-member firm here in Santa Barbara, California, and continue to be involved in the defense of the faith and publishing in that area.
Now, I'm curious about your faith journey, and you mentioned how you were raised in Christian Science.
Right.
And I know that in your book, The Defense Never Rests, A Lawyer's Quest for the Gospel, you talk a bit about your journey from unbelief to faith. So I'm curious, would you mind telling our listeners a bit about that journey and what factors came into play in your coming to faith?
Yeah, sure. I really never investigated Christianity before I went to college. My brother had some contact with Christianity in high school through a group he had over to the house, but I thought they were really silly people, or not interested in addressing serious questions about the truth claims that I thought were most important if somebody's going to ask you to be involved in a religion. And I was only involved in Christian Science because my parents basically made us go. So when I went to the university, I was pretty much a wide open field, was an atheist when I began, and went into the freshman dorm, and little did I know, some very serious Christians with apologetical training who were seniors were resident advisors there, and they actually chose to be in the freshman dorm. And I had hardly unpacked my suitcase, I don't think I had, before they had descended upon me, began to ask questions about where I was in terms of the claims of Jesus Christ. Any question that I had, they had a reasonable answer to. They had the latest book by either C.S. Lewis or Josh McDowell or John Warwick Montgomery to answer those kinds of questions. It was really a situation where I realized that I was committing intellectual suicide by not becoming a Christian. And so that kind of influence drove me to becoming a Christian at that time, based on the overwhelming evidence that there was to the case for Christianity, and having a very supportive, immediately supportive Christian community. And I don't think I'd been a Christian more than a few months, and they had me out there talking to other people. Not sure that was the greatest idea in the world, but as I look back on it, it formed a lot of things that I was to do later in terms of lectures and debates on campuses. So I'm grateful for it now, but was truly speaking to the limits of my my knowledge at the front end. But it was people who cared very intensely about non-Christians that got to me at the university at that very critical freshman year, which is interesting because I know there's a lot of people in the Christian faith today who became Christians in the early years of their university life, and I can't stress how important to me it is to to reach those people at those first years of going to the university.
Well, that's such a crucial time, and so many crucial decisions are made during that time that are so formative for the rest of our lives. And I know Campus Crusade for Christ has played a huge role in so many people's journey. And you got involved with Campus Crusade. You've done a ministry with them. And I'm just wondering how you got in touch with John Warwick Montgomery and studied apologetics there under him.
Yeah, I think the trajectory was Campus Crusade and the other campus groups that I had involvement with at the university level were interested in evangelism, as of course the Scriptures are itself. Our Lord's last words were, "Go into all the world and preach the gospel." And so they were serious about evangelism, and you recognize, I think, pretty quickly that if you're serious about evangelism, that means you're serious about dialoguing with non-Christians. And you pretty quickly find out that they have reasons why they don't believe, some of them do. And they articulate those reasons, and they challenge your Christian faith, and they make you sharpen iron in order to deal with those objections. And so my interest in practical evangelism, which was immediately there with Campus Crusade, after all, that's how I had become a Christian, through their evangelistic efforts, that led me pretty directly to a natural interest in apologetics. Nobody had to force me to read the latest apologetical books by, at that time, this is in the early 80s, that was basically the staple of Lewis, Josh McDowell, John Warwick Montgomery, F.F. Bruce, Edward John Carnell, those kinds of people, Wilbur Smith. And no one had to convince me. I had to read those people, because if I didn't, I was going to have my head handed to me on a platter the next day by non-Christians in the square at the university. So that naturally led to an apologetical interest, but I could only go so far in my self-study, and that's when I had the opportunity to do a couple of years intensive apologetical training at the Simon Greenleaf Law School, which integrated evidentiary techniques and legal approaches to the defense of the faith with the defense of the gospel itself. So that led me to the school where I took classes with, among other people, Montgomery. He had assembled at that time in the 80s, I think, the most remarkable apologetical faculty. I think it's the apologetical equivalent of basketball's dream team. He had Walter Martin and Harold Lindsell, and he brought in all the heavyweights there to teach. And that's where I really was able to spend a couple of concentrated years getting depth in areas related to the defense of the faith and the various challenges to Christian truth claims that are raised by thinking non-believers.
From your perspective as a lawyer, then, how do you approach or present the evidence or the content for Christianity? Do you bring it with a unique angle then?
Well, I think we really do. The first thing I'd want people to recognize is that I'm certainly not the first lawyer to write on lawyers' interest in Christianity and bringing legal techniques to the defense of the faith. This isn't, I'm not doing this sui generis as a never-before-done kind of technique. In fact, lawyers historically have been exceedingly interested in Christian truth claims in particular. That's why you have Christian legal societies. You don't have a lot of Buddhist legal societies out there. You have Christian legal societies because the claims of Christianity uniquely lend themselves to being verified or, as may be, falsified by some lawyers who have tried to bring down the Christian faith. But I think in direct answer to your question, Brian, I think there are three things that lawyers can bring as a unique perspective on the defense of the faith. First, lawyers are interested in evidence. Anybody who goes through the legal education has to have specific training in evidence. What kind of evidence is admissible? And in Western legal cultures, we've spent a tremendous amount of effort in the common law tradition in England, brought over to the United States, a tremendous amount of time in honing and refining those evidentiary standards for what we will accept in a court of law to prove a fact. Lawyers, lawsuits, courts, judges are very interested in facts initially. What in fact happened. And so evidence is the bread and butter of a trial lawyer, which is what I am, in everyday usage. So first, lawyers have a great interest in evidence, and Christianity uniquely is an evidentiary religion. If certain facts are not the case, according to 1 Corinthians 15, Paul says we're of all to be pitied. We've deceived ourselves, we've deceived others, and we should eat, drink, and be merry. Paul would be a flaming hedonist, not a moralist pietist, if Christianity is false. So you have evidence as number one prong. Number two prong, I think that the law brings, is an emphasis on the burden of proof, to understand how burden of proof is met, the importance of who has a burden of proof in asserting and defending a claim. And I think there the impact of the law is to clarify that the person asserting the claim has certainly the initial burden of proof. And Christians are making certain claims. They should seek to marshal the evidence for the case that God was in Christ, that Christ lived a perfect life on our behalf and died an atoning death on Calvary's cross and rose again for our justification. That's a burden of proof that the Christian has. It's not enough just to refute non-Christian positions and do what I call negative apologetics. You must provide affirmative evidence for why people should believe, which is why I say with a non-Christian you should spend 58 minutes of every hour with the affirmative evidence for Christianity and 2 minutes on negative apologetics. So evidence, burden of proof, and I think finally what the law brings is a focus on going for a verdict, on not leaving people in intellectual discussions, in debates, in the world of does God exist alone, but pushing for the result that people will take this evidence and realize that it demands not only assent to the facts, but fiducia, as the Reformers said, trust in those facts for them, that this was actually accomplished on their behalf and for their salvation. So those are the three areas I think lawyers and historically have developed an interest in: the evidence, the burden of proof, and going for a verdict. And it's been done by lawyers for, the first textbook of apologetics ever done was Hugo Grotius's De Veritate Religionis Christianae, the defense of the Christian religion back in the 16th century, and lawyers have been doing hundreds, literally, of books on the defense of the Christian faith since then.
Well, fascinating. I know you've written a couple of books yourself. I mentioned the first one, but your second one here that I'd like to unpack slightly is Religion on Trial. What's your goal and approach in this book?
Well, the goal here is pretty simple. It's to examine religious truth claims by the rules of legal evidence. That's the goal. And what the book endeavors to do is to help people realize that a number of religious positions aren't making truth claims at all, and to not waste your time bringing objective criteria for verifying or falsifying a religious truth claim if, in fact, no such claim is being made. For many religions, the Eastern religions, the New Age religions, it's really not an issue of whether it's true or false. That wouldn't resonate with them. The questions are whether this works, feels right, is consistent with their humanity, etc. So first is to determine which religions are making truth claims, and secondly, which of these claims can be checked out by the rules of evidence and either verified or falsified. And the book tries to look at this perspective of if I was a seeking or open non-Christian, just weighing the evidence, where would it lead me? And maybe the answer is that all religions are false, or none of them are worth checking out, or they're all equally true in some bland sense, or does any or do any of them stand out as being historically verifiable and reaching to the deepest needs of the human condition.
Well, I like what you're saying there about truth claims, and some religions are not making truth claims, others are, whether maybe explicitly or implicitly. Well, I think even, atheism, even in denying that God exists, is making, say, a truth claim. So sometimes we see these bumper stickers with this word coexist spelled out in the shape of, various religious symbols such as the cross or the Star of David and the crescent and stuff like that. And the implication there is that we can all just get along, but certainly there's contradictions between certain truth claims of these religions. So in your book here, Religion on Trial, what is the methodology that you use in order to start to investigate truth claims and sort of expose them for what they are?
Yeah, your question is a very important question, is the methodology we use to investigate religious claims, because your illustration there of the bumper sticker with the cross, the Star of David, the crescent on them, gives the impression that all religions are basically saying the same thing, or even if they're not, it really doesn't matter. And I think the problem with that is the confusion in modern culture between tolerance and truth. The concept is floating around out there that because we're tolerant of various religious positions, that must mean that they have equal claims concerning the truth questions, and nothing could be farther from the truth. The fact that we are tolerant of, in the United States at least, and in other cultures with the common law tradition, the fact that we are tolerant of religious freedom, that we allow people to preach any wacko doctrine they want to. People can walk down the street with signs saying, "I am God, worship me." In my town alone here in Santa Barbara, California, we have over 260 religions. We have Druids here. We don't go persecuting these people, throwing them in jail for their beliefs. That is what tolerance is about. But that is a far cry from saying that these claims have some semblance of truth to them, that they can in fact be factually verified or falsified. So the way or method to get to your answer to your direct question, the method that we would investigate those claims is the same method. It's not a unique method to lawyers or to religion. It's the same method you'd use to check out any claim. In fact, it's the way you operate in the world to cross the street. It's in fact what's known as the empirical method, and it's a species of the scientific method. The law employs it. Historical research employs the basic method of investigating facts in the world, trying to first determine what in fact the claims are, applying the laws of logic to those claims, seeing if they can be verified or falsified. And the empirical method is a method that doesn't seek to eliminate facts because of presuppositions, but seeks to investigate. The empirical method seeks to assume the least and prove the most. And I think that is critical. The empirical method doesn't say, oh, by the way, you might as well not even try to check out a resurrection because one's never occurred. The empirical method says, well, how good are the truth claims concerning that event? What is the evidence? Who are the eyewitnesses? What other explanation could there be for the event? And doesn't seek to eliminate inquiry, but to subject all the claims to a rigorous standard that we call the empirical method. So Religion on Trial spends some time on that topic of how do we discern truth claims, if ones are even being made, what method should be employed. And the fact is it's not a spiritual method, it's not a Christian method to find out what the truth claims are. It's a method that we use every day to walk across the street. It's involved with probabilities, it's involved with fact gathering, developing interpretations that take into account the most number of facts and eliminate the least number of facts. and understands that the world can be a very strange and unpredictable place. And that doesn't mean that a fact didn't occur. It just means it may be a very unique fact. So that's the way that we go about investigating those religious claims.
All right, well, that's a good description there, Craig. And I'm thinking about how this methodology plays out with believers and unbelievers. And I think that many unbelievers would be appreciative of that approach, saying, oh, good, yeah, that's what I want. Hard facts, and let's use some empiricism here. Now, some Christians, not all, they might take an approach apologetically that would maybe frown upon evidences, or using a legal approach saying, hey now, God's the judge, but you've just put yourself in, the place of the judge, and now you're putting God on trial. That's not your place, and this isn't honoring God. Do you have some scriptural precedent for this sort of approach?
Yeah, I was just going to say that if you don't use evidence, you really are not going to be operating apostolically in your defense of the faith. What you're going to be thrown back on is a subjective, perhaps personal testimony of how your life is consistent with the truth claims that you're teaching. But in fact, the message of the gospel is the reason we need Christ is because we're not consistent with the moral code that we think we're keeping. So yes, there is very solid biblical support for using evidence. I would push people to read very carefully, for example, the apostolic efforts in this regard, Acts 26, certainly Paul at Mars Hill in Acts 17, but the Acts 26 with Festus and Agrippa, where Paul says, look, these things did not happen in a corner. Yes, my life has been changed. Yes, Paul had a testimony more dramatic than I would dare say anybody living in the world today. He had a personal vision of Jesus Christ that remarkably changed his life. But he doesn't focus on that. He tells them, look, my life has been changed, but that isn't what saves. That's not the gospel. The gospel is Jesus Christ's death and resurrection. And there are a lot of people that saw that are wandering around here now that you can talk to. And you can check that out. So definitely the use of evidence is put, the stamp of approval is put on that by the apostles themselves. Certainly your program, Apologetics 3:15, is based, I assume, on 1 Peter 3:15. Be ready to always give a reason for the hope that's within you. Be ready to give evidence. Be prepared. Do your homework. Give people something other than just yourself and your supposed consistent Christian living for them to check out and investigate when you're gone and when their life is at the bottom of the bottom. And maybe they think it's particularly hopeless if they're to be having to live like you are, and bring them to the only answer, which is an answer outside of all of us, which is at the cross of Jesus Christ. So very definitely evidential apologetics is apostolic. It seeks to have people assume the least and seeks to prove the most, and centers on the resurrection of Jesus Christ. It's Christocentric.
Oh, very good. Now, Craig, can we talk a bit here about how we can know things to be true? For instance, someone may believe Christianity is true, and then they say that they know it to be true, but maybe another person looking on at them would say, surely you can't say that you know. And so from a lawyer's perspective, are there things that are reasonable to believe without being able to maybe prove to someone else?
Well, there certainly are things that are reasonable to believe that you can't prove to others. For example, you get likely on an airplane, and your listeners do all the time, based on some evidence, but you don't have direct sensory evidence that the pilot, him or herself, is competent to operate the airplane. You certainly, some assumptions have been made based on evidence. You're at a commercial airline, you see other people getting on, maybe you saw the plane land and taxi up and it's the same pilots, but you don't have tangible eyewitness evidence that is being operated by somebody who's competent to do so, and yet you trust them with your very lives. So there are things, oftentimes it's reasonable, it's based on evidence. A lot of other people have gotten on airplanes without seeing the pilot. I mean, maybe there's a 6-year-old in there operating the plane. You have no idea. But, based on what you know, you believe it's reasonable to get on that airplane and trust your life with them. But you couldn't prove that the person operating that plane is competent. So that is definitely the case, that there are things that are reasonable to believe that can't be proven. However, when you're asking people to stake their eternal destiny on transcendent claims of someone like Jesus Christ, the claims that he can usher you into the next life, that he has conquered death by his work on Calvary's cross, when these kinds of claims are being made, it behooves us to check out the evidence directly, not just to believe because somebody said it, but actually look at how good the evidence is itself. And so when we're looking at those kind of major eternal destiny claims that religions are making, they shouldn't just ask people to believe it because it'll make their life better, but they should provide some tangible external evidence, and I believe evidence that's sufficient to withstand the judgment of a cross-examination in a court of law and in a trial. That's the kind of rigorous standard of truth-telling and verification that I like to see applied to any religious truth claims, and which have been applied to Christianity and seen its claims vindicated for ever since lawyers have been involved in the defense of the faith, which goes way, way back. I mean, Paul himself was legally trained, rabbinically trained, so this process is there all over the apostolic witness itself, and continues to today with people seriously putting the claims of Christianity on the witness stand to see if they stand up.
Mm-hmm. Well, I know that many of our listeners are probably not all lawyers, so they might be just somewhat familiar with some of the terminology that maybe lawyers would use or you would hear in a courtroom. Things like beyond reasonable doubt, or talking about the preponderance of the evidence. And I'm wondering, when we're investigating truth claims or presenting a case for Christianity, we talked there a bit about certainty, but to what standard or to what degree are we trying to present our case, and how do those sorts of terms come into play from your perspective?
Yeah, it's a very good question, because practically in apologetics, the question certainly comes up: how much evidence is necessary to prove a claim? And oftentimes, non-Christians will raise this issue. Well, look, if you're asking me to make a vital decision that has eternal ramifications, the evidence should be not just beyond a reasonable doubt, which is a legal standard in a criminal case, and certainly beyond what the lawyers call a preponderance of evidence, which is the standard in a civil case. It's got to be absolute evidence. That is 100% certainty. But in fact, in these kinds of matters, in factual matters, the standard can never be 100% certainty, because facts are always capable of changing in the future, of being found out to be incorrect. They always have to be subject to change and to being adjusted when future facts are found. So there's always a possibility that you have the situation wrong. Now, the non-Christian can say, well, then isn't it possible the resurrection didn't occur and we're going to find future facts to refute it? And my response to that is, well, it's been 2,000 years, and the people with the greatest motivation to find the body were those people in the first century. They were Romans and religious leaders at the time. They had every motivation and incentive to impeach this testimony, and they could not do it. And it behooves you to go with the evidence you have now, which says your eternal destiny is on the line with how you come down on the question of who Jesus Christ is. And you can't delay this decision because the evidence isn't 100%. My heavens, there's all kinds of evidence that's not 100% that we make life and death decisions on. We go to cancer doctors and get a diagnosis and allow ourselves to be cut open based on less than 100% evidence. We execute people in a court of law in the executioner's chair on less than 100% evidence. We do all kinds of events in life that have life and death ramifications based on less than 100% evidence. So the standard in the law in a criminal case is beyond a reasonable doubt. That is, the best explanation, the most reasonable explanation is what's being presented. Or the other way to say it is there's no more reasonable explanation of the events than that the accused did it. The jury is instructed if they can find a more reasonable explanation, they have to go with it. But that's the criminal standard. It's not 100% certainty, but it's beyond a reasonable doubt. It's not beyond all doubt. And in a civil case, it's to a preponderance of evidence, which is a majority of the evidence would suggest that this fact occurred. And no matter what standard you apply to the case for Christianity, and I apply the criminal standard beyond a reasonable doubt, Christianity has stood up when it has been put through the rigors of cross-examination by trial lawyers over and over again. So how much evidence is necessary to prove the resurrection? It's the same kind of evidence you find every day to prove any other kind of fact in history. I completely agree with the non-Christian that the implications of these facts being true are enormous. The fact that Napoleon met his demise at Waterloo may be a fact, but it doesn't exactly have important impacts on my life today. Whereas if Jesus Christ is who he claimed to be and verified it by his resurrection from the dead, I agree with the non-Christian that the implications of that are enormous, but that doesn't mean that the evidence would somehow be unusual evidence. Facts are facts. It's going to be how good are the documents that this evidence is presented in, how good is the testimony in that document, and is there external evidence in archaeology and other external contemporary sources that verify that this took place.
Oh, very good, and that's helpful information. Now, back to your book there, Religion on Trial. One of the things that you do there is you put the religious truth claims to the test, and I'm thinking about how one would go about disproving Christianity. Many times they'll get an email or something from a skeptic, and they're attacking some obscure Old Testament verse, saying that it's inaccurate, and spending a lot of time trying to disprove certain little facts, as if they succeed, that's the linchpin of my whole faith. And I'm just thinking that it wouldn't change much for me if they did succeed. So maybe we can make it easier on skeptics and talk a little bit about how one would go about actually disproving Christianity.
Yeah, and actually this isn't unique to lawyers. This is presented by the early lawyer Paul in 1 Corinthians 15. I mean, he's told skeptics how to do it. He's unlocked the key. He's let them look in the black box there of how you bring Christianity down, and a number of lawyers have accepted the challenge who are non-Christians and tried to disprove Christianity by going for this linchpin. And the linchpin is not such critical issues as whether Ruth was or was not a Moabitess or not. You've got to get to the central questions, and this is where law can be helpful. It focuses on what is absolutely necessary to disprove Christianity. It reminds me of the trial lawyer. The defense lawyer said, Your Honor, into the jury, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, there are 10 reasons why my client could not have committed the crime on July 23rd. He goes through 7 of them, and he gets to number 8. And now for my 8th reason, my client was dead. I'd suggest to people you start with the key linchpin that your client was dead, because that makes all the rest of it irrelevant. And Christianity does this. 1 Corinthians 15 does this. It says that the center to disproving Christianity is going after the resurrection. If you can come up with a more reasonable explanation of an interpretation that takes all the facts into account, doesn't dismiss facts because of what we'll call naturalistic assumptions that we all know that resurrections just can't occur. Well, the law says humbug to that. The law says prove it. Maybe it did occur. The world's a crazy place. Lots of events are non-repeating. In fact, almost all of history that's what it is, a non-repeating unique event that happened a long time ago. So go for the center of this. If you can destroy the foundation, which is the resurrection of Jesus Christ, according to 1 Corinthians 15, if you can wipe that out, then you have Jesus Christ's claims about himself being false. His death on the cross is simply a story of a 30-year-old Jew who's in the wrong place at the wrong time. Maybe you get a nice morality out of it, but I frankly think it's a highly naive morality. If there are no forgiveness of sins in the cross of Jesus Christ, if Christianity is not true, you should be living for yourself. Morality is just a social invention, and it presents that as the absolute linchpin to go about disproving it. So attack the witnesses to the resurrection, attack whether he was dead on the cross, try to find a more reasonable explanation for this resurrection appearance, which you sometimes find people in the Jesus seminar, which I debated in Haiti some time ago, which they're now working on the fact that, well, the apostles thought they saw him alive. So that's what you're getting in the biblical record. That's kind of where some people are left with trying to refute the resurrection. Frank Morrison did this, in fact, not a lawyer, but in a very good book called Who Moved the Stone, which you listeners should get a hold of. Morrison was a skeptic and went after the resurrection, and the first line of his book is, this is the book that a book that first refused to be written. The book that I wanted to write, I didn't get to write because the facts wouldn't let me. The resurrection was just that powerful.
Well, good. Well, we talked about the central linchpin that if you want to prove Christianity false, but conversely, I mean, if you're going to prove Christianity true, you also go for the resurrection, and sort of along that same line, what do you find the most convincing proof for the truthfulness of Christianity?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more that what I believe is important to do, and I think is apostolic, is to keep your apologetical approach Christocentric. It saddens me today in many ways that this is not the case, that you can go to a conference on apologetics sometimes and hear 3 days of discussion that even if they were true and everything they proved, it still doesn't deal with the direct claims of Jesus Christ, the historical claims backed up by the resurrection. So I think the most convincing proof of the truthfulness of Christianity is, again, that central issue of marshaling the affirmative evidence that God was in Christ reconciling the world unto himself, and that the resurrection indeed is the justification that he was the perfect sacrifice on our behalf at Calvary's cross, that sacrifice is fully acceptable, as Hebrews says, a pleasing aroma to the Father, because of the work done by the Son, the perfect life lived in the flesh, the atoning death for the sins of the world, and his resurrection in our justification. So it is I think the affirmative center of Christianity, and every truly apostolic Christian defense of the faith has to ultimately get there. I don't want to be misunderstood. It's not like I think the traditional proofs for the existence of God or philosophical apologetics have no place in Christianity. They certainly do have a place and have a meaningful place. My point, though, is that after all that is said and done, if all you have is a person in theism, you haven't pushed this to what is the center of the biblical witnesses, which is, what do people say about, as Jesus said, but who do you say that I am, which is the real center. And you want to get that out there as cleanly as you can, which is why I focus on the case for Jesus Christ, centering in the resurrection as quickly as I possibly can, because you get into arguments about the existence of God, you get into arguments about evolution, you get into arguments about certain Christian morality issues, and you'll be striking on that stuff from now until the cows come home, and you'll never present the case for the cross of Jesus Christ.
Well, very good. Craig, you're the U.S. Director of the International Academy of Apologetics, Evangelism and Human Rights in Strasbourg, France. And I've talked to John Montgomery before, and he's talked about the Academy. And what this Academy does is it meets for 2 weeks each summer in Strasbourg to provide advanced studies in apologetics to laymen or pastors. So now can you talk a bit about the work that you do with the Academy there?
Oh, happy to do so. The Academy is now we're on, I think, our 17th year. It meets in Strasbourg. The classes are taught in English. You don't have to have a dexterity in the French language, except if you want to get a really nice meal at night. It might be helpful to have that. But it's really an advanced layman's institute in apologetics that meets the middle 2 weeks of every July. And there's 20 seats available, and it's addressed to all walks of Christians who are interested in getting a serious presentation of the various areas in the defense of the faith. The courses are in 10 different areas, including historical apologetics, courses on philosophical apologetics, scientific apologetics, literary apologetics, biblical authority. We go through all the objections that are being raised today, and we have 4 faculty. 2 are there all the time, that is teach every summer, which is Dr. Montgomery and myself, and then we have 2 visiting professors every summer, and we've had everybody, the top people in Christendom teach for us: Gary Habermas, J.P. Moreland, Angus Manouge. It goes on, who we've had teach for us out there over 17 years. And it allows people to get their own questions answered. It's in a small enough setting that the teaching is very serious, but it's not, you don't have to have a PhD in theology or in philosophy to understand what we're doing here. And the kind of people that attend, I'm just thinking of the 20 that were here in July. I mean, we have a doctor, lawyer, dentist, 4 or 5 pastors from all kinds of denominations, an undergrad, high school student, it's just housewife. We had it, which is every summer, is that kind of person. They're all united by their interest in trying to get more depth to deal with the serious concerns of the unbeliever. And, the added benefit is we have a fabulous social program that goes along with the 2 weeks out there that includes a phenomenal trip down the Rhine and the Bastille Day trip that we do, and we have all kinds of wonderful social events that are tied up with the Academy. But it's a wonderful experience that people can have for both laymen and pastors to get more training in a very concentrated period of time in the defense of the faith.
Well, great. I've heard back from a particular listener who made it out there for the Academy this summer, and they really enjoyed it. I want to encourage our listeners to find out more by going to apologeticsacademy.eu to find out more about the Academy. Now, Craig, just a couple more questions, and these are sort of advice questions. You've done lectures and debates on, over 100 universities and colleges across the U.S. and I'm sure abroad. So what do you think are some of the valuable lessons that you've learned as an apologist through your experience doing that?
I would say there's 3 things. First, be Christocentric. I've learned this by failure for, I think, way too many times in my time as doing a lot of speaking. I did not make my presentation Christocentric. Christ was kind of tacked on at the end as being a better moral example, I'm sorry to say, but a lot of the speaking and teaching were in areas not central to the truth claims of Christianity. So I would encourage people to become well-versed in the evidence for the case for Christianity and be able to articulate that and be Christocentric in your apologetical presentation. Secondly, do your homework. There is no substitute for being prepared. That doesn't mean you have to have every answer to every question at all. It does mean, though, that when you are asked a question and you feel you have inadequately responded to it, that you do have a sacred duty to do the homework, that the answers are out there. And one thing we do at the Academy is let people know where those answers can be found. We hope to address all of them adequately to everyone's satisfaction at the Academy, but we provide extensive bibliographical resources for people to get more depth so that people are not speaking off the cuff. I've found as a trial lawyer the best preparation for nerves in front of a jury is to prepare. Study to be prepared. And we are encouraged in Scripture and admonished, in fact, to be prepared, to give a reason for the hope that's within us. It's not a biblical option to do apologetics. It is essentially biblically commanded to be prepared. So that's the second thing. And then third, and this sounds like my days from Campus Crusade, but it happens to be true, is truly leave the results to God. I have seen more things happen at events that I thought were a complete disaster, where the numbers were 1/5 of what everyone told me they were supposed to be, that things didn't go well, there was this mishap or that mishap. You never know what the Lord's intention may be at some place where Christ and his saving work has been presented. All kinds of ramifications of that happen. The word goes out, it doesn't return void, and when Christ is at the center of it, you just leave those results, I think, to God. Many times today when we see the people speaking to thousands and thousands and thousands, we think it's unsuccessful if we're just speaking to one person on a bus, or we're with a very small group, and boy, I went to this event and only 5 people showed up. You have no idea the importance of who you're speaking to, and that is an important thing to keep in mind all the time, is just leave those results, whatever they are, numbers or not so great numbers, leave those results to God.
Well, that's great advice, Craig. I appreciate it. And it's been a real privilege speaking with you today. Thanks for taking the time to do this interview.
Oh, my privilege, Brian. Best to you and your important ministry.
I have been speaking with Craig Parton, attorney, author of The Defense Never Rests, A Lawyer's Quest for the Gospel and Religion on Trial, and the U.S. Director of the International Academy of Apologetics, Evangelism and Human Rights in Strasbourg, France. Links to Craig Parton's resources and books can be found at today's blog post at Apologetics 315. If you're on Facebook, be sure to like Apologetics 315 for daily updates. Also, you can follow on Twitter for all the best links to apologetics resources throughout the day. Do you have any ideas or feedback for these interviews? Just send an email to interviews@apologetics315.com. If you'd like to help with Apologetics 315, just hit the support button on the website to find out how. We're a recognized nonprofit and donations are tax deductible. If you have a question you'd like me to address in an upcoming podcast, just let me know. Email me at brian@apologetics315.com. This is Brian Oughton, and thanks again for listening.